In the 4 weeks of Advent, the prophet Isaiah, John the Baptist, Mary of Nazareth, and Joseph help us to welcome God with us, Emmanuel. This first week in our Advent liturgy, we're hearing the strong voice of Isaiah the prophet. Isaiah was a priest in the Temple of Jerusalem in the 8th century before Christ. A priest then was not just simply engaged in temple worship. Isaiah was also deeply engaged in the politics of Jerusalem. You can hear it as he scolds and encourages and warns one king after another. He's watching every move they make, they and their armies with them. He has CNN on all the time. What saved Isaiah from being trapped in politics or becoming simply a political commentator was a vision of God he had, which he describes in the 6th chapter of his writings. He had an overwhelming experience of God in the temple's Holy of Holies. And that vision was so overwhelming that military and political power faded into insignificance. He's constantly calling his people back to rely on God's promises, away from vain attempts to find security in human plans and intrigues. And that vision made him aware how great God was and how small our achievements as human beings are. Of course, most of Isaiah's contemporaries must have thought his words were unreal. They were looking at the real world, and their real world was coming to an end. That was because Assyrian armies were rumbling toward Jerusalem, bringing slaughter, devastation, and defeat. And here's someone telling them that all nations are streaming toward the Lord's mountain, beating their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. All nations will live in harmony, no more wars. This mountain is like a rock that's absolutely secure. His vision seems unreal. But Isaiah's message comes not from what he sees with his eyes, but from God, Emmanuel, God with us. One of the great theologians of the Second Vatican Council, the French Dominican Yves Congar, wrote a book called The Mystery of the Temple, 1962. The book is about the presence of God in sacred history, the history of the patriarchs and the prophets. Congar wrote the book as France was experiencing rapid secularization. People were abandoning God and the church. So he was watching the world that he knew and he loved disappear. And he was wondering where God was in all of this. In one sentence of the book, he says, "We're always tempted to confine ourselves to what we see and touch, to be satisfied with this and to think that a preliminary achievement fulfills God's promise." Abraham thought God's promise was fulfilled in Ishmael. Joshua thought it was fulfilled in the conquest of Canaan. Solomon thought it was in his immediate descendants. But these promises were capable of more complete fulfillment, which would only materialize after long periods of waiting and urgently need purification. Only the prophets, and this is their task, draw attention to the process of development from seminal promises to a greater fulfillment. And so we listen, especially in bad times when things seem to be falling apart. We listen to prophets like Isaiah as they speak of God's promises. God's promises are real. They're great, greater than we can imagine, greater than we can hope for. We rely only on what we see before us. In Advent, We need to keep the prophets company and let their words lift us up to see what they saw. Emmanuel, God with us.